The gravel crunched under the tires of my old Land Rover, a sound like dry bones grinding, as I navigated the winding, overgrown drive. Trees, ancient and gnarled, clawed at the gray sky, their branches forming a skeletal archway that swallowed the last of the afternoon light. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, a familiar tension settling in my shoulders. This was it. The inheritance. The Manor. My life up to this point had been a symphony of precision. Every antique clock mechanism I painstakingly restored, every faded canvas I brought back to life, demanded an almost obsessive attention to detail. My workshop was a sanctuary of order, filled with the scent of linseed oil and aged wood, a quiet testament to patience and exactitude. I thrived on the tangible, on the beauty of objects that held stories, their flaws and triumphs laid bare for me to mend. Perhaps that's why the prospect of this manor, a sprawling monument to decay, both daunted and intrigued me. It was the ultimate restoration project, a challenge that dwarfed anything I'd ever undertaken. The house loomed into view, a hulking silhouette against the bruised horizon. It wasn't merely old, it was ancient, its stone walls stained with centuries of rain and neglect, like a forgotten leviathan hauled from the depths. Dormer windows, blind eyes staring out from under heavy brows of slate, seemed to watch my approach. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, throttled one entire wing, pulling at the eaves, its tendrils snaking into every crevice. There was a profound silence here, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the skeletal trees and the distant caw of a crow. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full, pregnant with untold stories, with the weight of time. I parked the Rover near what must have once been a meticulously manicured rose garden, now a thorny tangle of wild growth. The air, even from outside the vehicle, was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old iron or stagnant water. I killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was absolute, pressing in on me. The house was enormous, far larger than the solicitor's photographs had suggested. Its sheer scale was overwhelming, a monument to a forgotten lineage. My gaze swept over the crumbling facade, the broken gargoyles, the ornate but corroded ironwork. This wasn't just a house, it was a mausoleum. It felt like approaching the entrance to a crypt. A blast of frigid, stagnant air, thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and something indefinably old, washed over me. It was the scent of forgotten lives, of trapped memories. I stepped over the threshold, my boots sinking slightly into a century of dust. I stood in the vast entrance hall, a cavernous space where light struggled to penetrate. A grand staircase, its banister carved with grotesque, grinning faces, swept upwards into the gloom. Tapestries, once vibrant, now hung in tattered shreds, resembling flayed skins. Every surface was cloaked in a fine, gray powder. It felt less like entering a home and more like entering an organism, dormant but still breathing. How could I even begin to untangle this? My initial survey was cautious. I moved from the hall into what I presumed was the drawing room. Heavy velvet curtains, stiff with dust, blocked out most of the light. Ghostly shapes of furniture, draped in white sheets, stood like silent sentinels. A challenge, yes. But also a deep well of unease. The library was next, its towering shelves crammed with leather-bound volumes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The air here was even heavier, imbued with the scent of decaying paper and dry rot. I ran a gloved hand over his spine, disturbing a cloud of fine dust that shimmered in the weak light filtering through a grimy window. As I explored, a peculiar architectural anomaly caught my eye. Tucked away behind what appeared to be a servant's stairwell, almost an afterthought, was a narrow, unadorned wooden door. It looked utterly out of place amidst the Manor's faded grandeur, stark and utilitarian. I pushed the door open. Beyond it lay not a pantry or a storage room, but a cramped, low-ceilinged passage, completely devoid of windows. As I ventured deeper, the walls, unlike the plaster and wood of the main house, were rough-hewn stone, crudely mortared. Then, the passage opened into a wider, longer corridor. On either side, heavy iron doors, pitted with rust, were set into the stone. Each door had a small, barred window, and a slot at the bottom. My flashlight beam danced over the grim details, revealing the stark, brutalist architecture that was utterly alien to the rest of the manor. My breath hitched. What in God's name was this place, and why was it here, buried within the walls of an inherited manor? This was more than decay, this was a deliberate echo of suffering, entombed within stone. I stood frozen, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, as the true, horrifying scale of my inheritance began to dawn on me. The suffocating void of the old death row corridor marked for closure had nearly swallowed me whole. I'd stumbled backward, gasping, the reek of damp earth and something far more ancient clinging to my clothes. The words I'd found, scrawled on the stone, echoed in my mind, a chilling, utterly baffling declaration. What was this place? Why was it here, hidden beneath the very foundations of the manor I had inherited? My meticulous nature, my need for order, screamed for answers, but the sheer, unsettling mystery of it all was too much to confront just then. My instincts, usually so reliable, were screaming for retreat. I would seal it, for now. I couldn't process it, couldn't even begin to understand it. The immediate task was the manor itself, a grand, decaying beast that needed my attention. I needed to restore, to bring light and life back into its dusty corners, to impose my will on its crumbling grandeur. Perhaps then, with my hands busy, my mind would settle. The next morning, I began. I chose the study on the ground floor, a cavernous room overlooking what was once a sprawling rose garden, now a tangle of thorns and weeds. It was an ambitious starting point, but I needed a challenge, something to anchor me. The room was a monument to neglect, heavy velvet drapes, stiff with age and dust, hung like shrouds over the tall windows, mahogany bookshelves, stripped bare, gaped like empty eyes, and a massive oak desk, scarred and forgotten, dominated the center. I laid out my tools with practiced precision, chisels, brushes, solvents, fine sandpaper, delicate polishing cloths. I started with the desk, a magnificent piece that deserved to be resurrected. I carefully brushed away layers of grime, revealing the rich grain beneath. The work was slow, methodical, a balm to my frayed nerves. Hours melted into the afternoon. I was engrossed, lost in the rhythm of restoration. I reached for my smallest wood-carving chisel, the one with the finely tapered point, but my hand met empty air. I frowned. I just used it to scrape away some stubborn varnish near the desk's edge. I glanced around my carefully organized workstation. It wasn't there. Odd, I muttered to myself. I must have set it down somewhere else. I checked the toolbox, the nearby window ledge, even the top of the desk again. Nothing. A faint prickle of irritation began to form. I was meticulous. I didn't misplace tools. After a minute of fruitless searching, I sighed, grabbed a slightly larger chisel, and continued my work. A few minutes later, as I bent to examine a knot in the wood, my gaze fell upon the desktop. There, resting neatly on a stack of polishing cloths I hadn't touched in an hour, was the small, tapered chisel. My brow furrowed. I distinctly remembered putting it in the tray. Had I? My mind felt a little fuzzy around the edges, a side effect, I told myself, of the stress from yesterday's discovery. I dismissed it as an oversight, a momentary lapse in concentration. The house was vast, silent, and I was utterly alone. It was easy to get lost in one's own thoughts. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of bruised purple and gray, the study grew dim. I worked on, relying on the fading light, postponing switching on the temporary lamps I'd set up. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across rough plaster, from somewhere above me. I paused, my hand stilling on the desk. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. Only the echo answered. I waited, straining my ears. The sound didn't repeat. It was probably just the wind, I reasoned, or an old pipe rattling. This house had more structural quirks than I could count. I went back to work, but the spell of concentration was broken. I felt a subtle shift in the air, a cool current that snaked around my ankles, despite the room being sealed. It was indistinct, a sound on the very edge of hearing, like dry leaves rustling across a stone floor. It seemed to emanate from the far corner of the room, near the empty fireplace. I stopped again, my breath catching. My scalp tingled. There was no wind inside. No leaves. Just the looming shapes of furniture, the bare walls, but the feeling. It was a distinct sensation of being observed. My skin crawled. I felt eyes on me, heavy and unblinking, from somewhere just beyond the reach of my vision. I spun around, sweeping my gaze across the entire room, but found only the deepening gloom. I was alone, yes, but the house no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. And whatever occupied it was watching me. I still couldn't shake the feeling that the air in that place had been thicker. Like breathing in dust motes of pure despair. My hands were shaking. This was ridiculous. I was an antique restorer, a man of logic and meticulous detail. I'd seen crumbling foundations, dry rot, centuries of neglect. This was just an old house, albeit a particularly stubborn and unsettling one. The smells? Just decomposition. The feeling? My own exhaustion, perhaps a touch of claustrophobia. I hadn't slept properly in days, certainly not since arriving at this isolated, hulking monument to forgotten lives. I rubbed my temples, trying to massage away the dull ache that had taken root behind my eyes. What was I even doing in this place? The will had been clear, the inheritance undeniable, but I was beginning to question my sanity for taking it on. Distraction. That was what I needed. I decided to tackle the antechamber adjacent to the library, a room I'd only briefly surveyed. It was less imposing than the grand halls, less overtly menacing than the cellar. Just a small, forgotten space choked with peeling wallpaper and the ghosts of forgotten furniture. I grabbed my tools, a scraper, a soft brush, a bucket of warm water, and a mild solvent. The methodical nature of restoration, the slow revealing of what lay beneath, usually calmed me. It was a meditation in reverse, stripping away layers of time rather than adding them. The wallpaper in the antechamber was a particularly ghastly floral pattern, faded to a sickly yellow, bubbling in places like diseased skin. As I began to carefully scrape it away, the plaster underneath revealed itself in patches. It was a slow, dusty process. The air grew thick with the smell of old paper and gypsum. I worked systematically, corner to corner, listening to the soft rip-rip-rip of the wallpaper peeling free. Halfway along the north wall, my scraper snagged. Not on a nail, or a rough patch of plaster, but something firmer, unyielding. I paused, my brow furrowed. I ran my fingers over the spot, feeling a faint, almost imperceptible seam beneath the paper. Too straight. I leaned closer, brushing away more of the flaking paper. The seam continued, a fine line running vertically, then horizontally, forming a subtle rectangle about 4 feet high and 2 feet wide. It was almost perfectly flush with the wall, expertly plastered over, then wallpapered. A hidden compartment. My heart gave a little jolt. This was the kind of discovery that thrilled me, usually. A secret panel, a forgotten nook. A piece of the Manor's history waiting to be uncovered. But a prickle of unease started to spread through me. I carefully chipped away at the plaster along the seam, the dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy window. It was slow-going, painstaking work. Each fleck of plaster falling away felt like peeling back a layer of skin from something ancient and sleeping. I could feel a faint draft, as if the compartment, even sealed, was breathing. Finally, with a soft click and a shower of plaster dust, a section of the wall gave way. It wasn't a door, not exactly. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was certainly old. Profoundly old. It wasn't a room, but a deep recess, a kind of stone locker built into the thick wall. Carefully, I widened the gap, pushing the heavy slab inward until it scraped against something within. I shone my lamp inside. Nestled on a narrow shelf of rough-hewn stone sat a single, leather-bound volume. They looked almost branded into the leather, stark and black against the aged material. The leather itself was cracked and dry, like ancient skin. I reached in, my fingers brushing against the rough stone, then the surprisingly smooth, cool leather. As my hand closed around it, a strange jolt, not electrical, but something akin to a static shock, went through me. I pulled the book out, cradling it in my hands. It felt heavy, disproportionately so for its size. I opened it carefully, the spine groaning in protest. The pages were thick, handmade paper, brittle and yellowed, filled with incredibly fine, cramped handwriting. The script was archaic, almost indecipherable at first glance, but definitely English. And the ink. I flipped through a few pages, the faint, dry smell of the book tickling my nose. The entries were dated, though the years were so far back they blurred into the distant past. What caught my eye wasn't the script, but the occasional crude drawing interspersed amongst the text, stick figures with elongated limbs, distorted faces, geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. And repeated, over and over, were those same branded symbols from the cover, scrawled in the margins like desperate prayers or warnings. One particular passage, written in a larger, more frantic hand, made me pause. I struggled to decipher the faded script. The blurring. What was I? Did I forget? The face in the glass is not mine. It spoke of a profound confusion, a loss of self. As I stared at the page, trying to make sense of the frantic scrawl, a peculiar sensation washed over me. For a moment, a fleeting, terrifying moment, I couldn't recall what I was doing. The book in my hands felt alien. The room around me seemed unfamiliar. I looked down at my own hand holding the journal, and for a split second, it didn't feel like my hand. I shook my head, blinking hard. It passed as quickly as it came. Absolute exhaustion. This place was getting to me, playing tricks on my mind. The metallic tang in the air from the hidden recess seemed to intensify, and I could have sworn, just for an instant, that the strange symbols on the book's cover pulsed with a faint, internal light. I closed the journal, the snap of the old leather echoing loudly in the suddenly silent room. And I, Reed, was very much inside it. Identity, the feast. I retreated, not to my bed, but to the makeshift study I'd set up in the Manor's library. I scrubbed my hands raw, the water from the basin turning a faint, rusty pink. Sleep, when it finally came, was a fractured thing. I found myself wandering through endless, identical hallways, each door a mirror reflecting a stranger's face. I woke with a jolt, tangled in the sheets, the phantom scent of something like decay and old parchment filling my nostrils. The lamp still burned, its wick low, the room awash in a sickly, yellow glow. This wasn't just a decaying house, it was a repository of something malevolent. And those words. Memory is the meal. Identity, the feast. They gnawed at me. I needed answers, not just about the Manor's architecture, but its history. My research began, a frantic dive into the local archives. The nearest municipal building housed a small, dusty collection of historical records. The archivist, a stooped man with spectacles perched on his nose, regarded me with mild curiosity. I explained my restoration project, omitting the more peculiar details. He directed me to boxes labeled local estates, pre-1900. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of scanning microfiche, sifting through brittle newspaper clippings, and deciphering faded handwritten ledgers. The air in the archives was thick with the scent of aging paper and dust, a comforting, familiar smell that usually grounded me. I found scattered mentions of the Manor, mostly property transfers, tax records. Then, a faint tremor of unease began. The first hint was a series of small, almost insignificant notices from the late 1800s. Local merchant, Mr. Alastair Finch, reported missing from his residence, Blackwood Manor. No foul play suspected. A few years later, another, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, believed to have wandered from Blackwood Manor, found disoriented miles away, unable to recall her own name or family. Disorientation. Memory loss. The accounts were fragmented, disjointed. There were no sensational headlines, no grand investigations. Just quiet, almost apologetic notes, as if the disappearances and instances of mental collapse were an unfortunate, yet accepted, side effect of living in the Manor. One particularly disturbing snippet described a Manor resident, a young woman named Clara, who, after a prolonged stay, began speaking in an archaic dialect, claiming her memories were not her own, but echoes of forgotten lives. He was eventually taken away, the article implying a gentle, sorrowful dismissal of her delusions. I worked late into the night, fueled by strong, bitter coffee. The more I read, the more the pieces clicked into a terrifying mosaic. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents, it was a pattern. A slow, insidious pattern of erosion. People entered the Manor, and then, subtly, their essence began to unravel. As I pieced together these grim fragments, the entity's influence intensified. Then came the memory gaps. Small at first. I'd set down a tool, turn to grab something else, and when I looked back, the tool was gone, only to reappear minutes later in a place I swore I hadn't put it. Or I'd be in the middle of a task, my mind a blank, wondering what I was doing, what I had just been doing. One evening, after returning from the archives, I found my meticulous notes on the Manor's history scattered across the library floor. Pages were torn, some scrawled with childish, nonsensical symbols I didn't recognize. I remembered placing them neatly on the desk before I left. I remembered distinctly. My hands trembled as I gathered the ruined papers. Had I done this in some waking stupor? Was I losing time? There was a weariness etched around them that hadn't been there weeks ago. I was becoming the feast. The bitter coffee had done its work, turning my mind into a sharp, buzzing instrument, but it couldn't banish the chill that had settled deep in my bones. The pattern was undeniable. A slow, insidious erosion. I'd read enough to know that the Manor wasn't just old, it was a hungry maw. People entered, and then, subtly, their essence began to unravel, unmake, unbecome. I couldn't let that happen to me. Determination, cold and hard, solidified in my chest. I wasn't just restoring a house, I was in a fight for my own mind. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight and a desperate resolve, I turned my attention to the Manor's forgotten corners. The blueprints, faded and brittle, had hinted at a section sealed off, a part of the original structure that had been deemed problematic. The mortar was old, crumbling easily under the pry bar. The air that seeped out was heavy, stagnant, carrying a faint, cloying sweetness that made my stomach clench. I stepped through the opening, the sound of my boots on the rough floor echoing unnervingly. My light swept across a row of iron-barred doors, each one a relic of some forgotten horror. This wasn't a dungeon, it was something far more specific, far more terrifying. The words, scrawled in faded, flaking white paint on a crumbling sign above the first cell, made my breath catch. Marked for closure. Not demolition, not renovation. Closure. As if the very space itself had been condemned. I pushed my hand against the nearest set of bars. Then I heard it. My flashlight beam danced, trying to pin down the source, but there was nothing. I took a step forward, then another. It wasn't English or any language I recognized, yet it carried an undeniable weight of suffering, of loss. My internal thoughts, usually so clear and focused, began to feel smudged at the edges. A sudden, sharp clang ripped through the air, like metal on stone, directly behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, the flashlight beam darting wildly. Nothing. The cell doors were still, the corridor empty. No answer, just the renewed, insistent murmuring, now seeming to come from inside the cells. A new scent joined the damp earth, something sickly sweet, like withered roses, but with an underlying metallic tang that tightened my throat. Then it started. A flicker at the edge of my vision. It solidified, not into a clear figure, but a wavering, indistinct outline. It moved, a slow, shambling gait, towards me. My mind screamed not real, but my body froze. The murmuring intensified, swirling around me, and now, woven into the unintelligible drone, I heard fragments of familiar voices. My mother's gentle scolding, my father's booming laugh, a colleague's dry comment about a difficult restoration. But they were distorted, stretched, like voices played back on a dying tape recorder. As it approached, the cell doors around me began to creak, a chorus of rusted hinges groaning. Remember what? My mind raced, trying to grasp onto something, anything. I was Reed. I was an antique restorer. I was in an old manor. But suddenly, those facts felt flimsy, like paper puppets in a hurricane. They was I? They was this my manor? They was I even me? A wave of profound disorientation washed over me, so strong it nearly buckled my knees. It wasn't just looking, it was sifting. And then, a memory flashed, vivid and terrifying. Not my own, but someone else's. He was screaming, but no sound came out. His eyes were wide with horror, fixed on something unseen. And then, his face went blank, utterly empty, like a slate wiped clean. A profound sense of loss echoed through me, a primal understanding of identity being meticulously erased. This wasn't just taking, it was unmaking. It was a deliberate, agonizing process of emptying. The death row wasn't about physical execution, but the death of the self. And it was doing it to me. My own name, Reed, felt foreign, a word without meaning. Who was I? What was my purpose here? The manor, the restoration, the documents, it all began to dissolve, replaced by a terrifying blankness. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching at the only solid thing I could think of, the rough, cold metal of my flashlight. My craft. My life. Myself. It was a desperate anchor in a sea of encroaching oblivion. The pressure in my head lessened, but the disorientation lingered, a dizzying hangover. I opened my eyes, gasping for breath. The corridor was still there, the cell doors still rusted, the air still heavy with decay. But I knew it had been real. The confrontation had been terrifyingly, intimately real. I stumbled backward, away from the silent cells, away from the crushing emptiness. My legs felt like jelly, my hands trembled uncontrollably. I scrambled back through the opening, pushing bricks back into place with frantic, unthinking movements, desperate to seal off that horror. The memories were there, but they felt distant, like photographs seen through a fogged pane of glass. I was Reed, I was. But the edges of that truth felt terrifyingly blurred, as if the entity had taken a bite out of my very core, and I was just beginning to feel the ache. The wave of profound disorientation didn't just recede, it slammed into me again, a cold, wet cloth pressed against my face, trying to erase the edges of everything I knew. They was I Reed? They was this my manor? I gripped the banister, my knuckles white, the rough, dust-caked wood biting into my palm, a tiny anchor in a sea of unreality. No. This was wrong. My name was Reed. I was an antique restorer. I was here to restore this place, this sprawling, decaying mansion. The facts felt thin, but they were there. They had to be. This creeping forgetfulness, this sense of being unmoored, it wasn't just old age or stress. This was something else. A surge of defiant anger, hot and sharp, cut through the fog. I wouldn't let it. I wouldn't. I had to get out. My first thought was the front door. Escape. Simple, direct. I pushed off the banister, the muscles in my legs feeling strangely heavy, like they belonged to someone else. The grand hall stretched before me, vast and silent, the air thick with the scent of damp plaster and something else, something cloying and ancient, like dried blood and dust motes. Each step I took on the worn Persian rug seemed to absorb the sound, leaving only the dull thud of my own heart against my ribs. I pushed. Nothing. I pulled. The door remained stubbornly shut, as if it were part of the wall itself. I leaned into it, putting my shoulder against the unyielding timber, grunting with effort. It didn't budge. Not an inch. It wasn't locked, it felt sealed. As if the very fabric of the house refused to let me pass. Panic, a dry, rasping thing, began to claw at my throat. Okay. The door was a no-go. What about a window? The thought felt childish even as it formed. I wasn't going to smash my way out like a desperate hooligan. Besides, the windows in this manor were enormous, many of them several stories up, and all were covered with heavy, grimy panes that looked like they hadn't been opened in a century. Contact. I needed contact. My phone. Where was my phone? I patted my pockets. Had I left it in the workshop? In my temporary bedroom? The details were hazy, like trying to catch smoke. I cursed under my breath, the sound swallowed by the cavernous hall. A landline. There had to be an old landline somewhere. I remembered seeing a dusty, ornate telephone table in a small parlor off the main dining room. The thought propelled me forward, a new surge of determination pushing back the fear. I navigated through the gloom, past hulking, draped furniture that seemed to watch me with silent, judging eyes. There it was, on a small, claw-footed table, an ancient rotary phone, black and heavy, its cord a tangled, brittle mess. I picked up the receiver. Dead. Of course it was dead. I slammed it back down, a wave of helplessness washing over me. No, I muttered, shaking my head. No, this isn't happening. I had to think. Logically. If the front door was sealed, and the phone was dead, what else? How far was it? I tried to picture the map, the route I'd taken. The road. I remembered the long, winding dirt track leading up to the manor. I could walk. It would take hours, but I could walk. I turned towards what I thought was the back of the house, where a lesser-used servant's entrance might be. Every corridor looked the same, high ceilings, peeling wallpaper, portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow me. I pushed open a heavy, unmarked door, expecting a utility room or a narrow back staircase. Instead, I stepped into a long, low-ceilinged passage I had never seen before. The walls were painted a dull, sickly green, streaked with what looked like rust and grime. Each door had a number painted on it, faded and chipped. This wasn't a servant's corridor. This felt institutional. Death row? Here? In this manner? The idea was monstrous, impossible. The entity wasn't just playing with my memories, it was twisting the very architecture of reality around me. It was weaving new, impossible spaces into the fabric of the manor, trapping me not just within these walls, but within its own monstrous design. The wall was solid behind me, a seamless expanse of sickly green. I was in. And there was no way out. Not this way. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Death row? Here? In this manner? The idea was monstrous, impossible. Yet, the corridor stretched before me, undeniable, terrifyingly real. The air grew heavier, thick with an unspoken dread. The sign, faded and peeling, still hung crookedly from a rusty hook at the entrance, a grim joke from another era. Individual cells lined both sides, their heavy iron doors rusted shut, some ajar just enough to reveal the crushing emptiness within. Each step was a deliberate act of courage. I peered into one cell, then another. They were barren, cold stone boxes. But in the third, something caught my eye. Scratched into the crumbling mortar between the stones, almost invisible under a layer of grime, were symbols. Not just random marks, but intricate, repeating patterns I'd seen before, in the Manor's oldest blueprints, on the strange wooden box I'd found, even faintly etched into the plaster in the hidden rooms upstairs. My fingers traced the rough lines, a shiver running down my spine. These weren't idle defacements. They were deliberate, perhaps even ritualistic. And next to them, scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand, was a name. Not a name I recognized, but beneath it, a date. A date from centuries ago, long before this manor was supposedly built, according to the official records. Panic began to coil in my stomach. I moved to the next cell, then the next. More carvings. More desperate, ancient script. It was a language I didn't understand, yet I felt a sickening familiarity, as if the meaning was pressing against the edges of my perception, just out of reach. Then, in the final cell at the end of the corridor, partially hidden behind a collapsed section of wall, I saw it. A small, wooden desk, warped and rotten, still standing against the far wall. On it, a stack of brittle, leather-bound journals. Their covers were cracked, pages yellowed and fused together by dampness and time. With trembling hands, I carefully opened the top journal. The script inside was archaic, but unlike the scrawled carvings, it was precise, almost scholarly. It detailed the manor's true history, a chronicle far older and infinitely more horrifying than any official document. It spoke of a family line, not merely inheriting land, but guarding it. Guarding something. The words blurred before my eyes, then sharpened into terrifying clarity. The entity. It wasn't just in the manor, it was the manor, in a way. Or perhaps, the manor was merely its physical manifestation, a conduit. It was ancient, not born of this world, but drawn to places of profound human suffering, places where memories were sharp and identity frayed. The journals described it as a parasite, a leech that didn't consume flesh, but the very essence of personhood. It fed on memory, not just the content, but the act of remembering. The process of recalling a loved one's face, a cherished childhood moment, a personal triumph, each flicker of memory was a morsel. Centuries ago, by an ancestor who understood its nature. This corridor, this death row, wasn't built for criminals. It was built as a containment, a place designed to concentrate and absorb the entity's feeding, a sacrificial ground where the most potent memories, those of a life about to end, of identity stripped away, could be contained, preventing the entity from spreading beyond these walls. The condemned were not merely executed, their final, vivid memories, their last desperate clinging to who they were, became sustenance. A morbid, horrific energy source to keep the entity from consuming the outside world. My stomach lurched. The full horror of it hit me like a physical blow. And now, with the manor in disrepair, with its defenses weakened, the entity was awake and hungry. It was breaking free. Not just death, but oblivion. To be utterly forgotten, to have never existed, to have your very essence absorbed until there was nothing left but a vacant shell, a ghost of a thought in the entity's ever-growing consciousness. That's what it wanted. That's what it was doing to me, slowly, insidiously. I read on, my eyes scanning frantically for a solution, a way to fight back. The last entry, scrawled in a desperate, shaky hand, detailed the only way to truly appease or defeat it. It wasn't about destroying the entity directly, it was about cutting off its food source. Starving it. All of them. A sacrifice. To cleanse the ground, one must burn the roots, the journal stated, the ink blurring as my vision swam. And the roots are remembrance. All of it. The good, the bad, the beautiful, the horrific. Every trace of what was must be extinguished. The manor must become a blank slate. To save oneself, one must sacrifice the very history that defines this place. That meant destroying everything I'd come here to restore. Erasing the history I'd been so obsessed with uncovering. What piece of me would be torn away in that cleansing fire? What would be left of Reed, the restorer of forgotten things, if he willingly forgot the very thing he sought to mend? My own past. The brittle pages crackled, still clutched in my numb fingers. A blank slate. The words echoed, not just in my head, but in the very air around me, a cold breath against my ear. My mind, already a fractured mosaic, tried to piece together the implications. Destroy everything I'd come here to restore. Erase the history I'd been so obsessed with uncovering. What piece of me would be gone? The question wasn't rhetorical anymore. It was a promise, a threat, a twisted kind of salvation. Names, faces, dates, they slipped like grains of sand through my fingers. Sometimes, I'd catch myself staring at my reflection, not quite recognizing the weary lines around my eyes, a haunted set of my jaw. Was that me? Or just a shell the entity hadn't quite finished hollowing out? If the entity fed on memory, then the only way to stop it was to starve it. Not just starve it, but to sever its connection to the wellsprings of its sustenance. The manor wasn't just old, it was a vast, sprawling archive of forgotten lives, each creaking floorboard, each faded tapestry, a tether to some long-lost moment. My restoration work, my meticulous uncovering of its secrets, had been an unwitting feast laid out for a hungry ghost. I had become its primary conduit, its living, breathing catalog. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The reveal. It wasn't just about destroying the objects of memory, but the links themselves. And it thrived most potently in places of profound, concentrated human emotion, places where lives had been lived, lost, or painfully ended. It had been sealed off, bricked up, a silent testament to some forgotten horror. It was a nexus, a scar on the manor's soul, and therefore, a primary feeding ground for the entity. My plan solidified, brutal and absolute. I wouldn't just destroy the physical remnants, I would perform an act of anti-restoration. I would sever the entity's connection to its most potent anchors, those places where identity had been most profoundly etched into the very stones. And the cost. The cost would be my own connection. My own memories. My own identity. I would become the blank slate I sought to create. A tragic hero? Or just a madman sacrificing the last fragments of himself to a phantom? It didn't matter. The alternative was to become nothing, a puppet animated by a nameless hunger. I pushed myself up, my knees protesting, a dull ache blooming in my skull. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen pressure, as if the manor itself was aware of my intent, tightening its grip. "What about the portrait of your mother?" a voice seemed to hiss, though no one was there. "The first antique you ever restored? The smell of your father's pipe tobacco?" They were my memories, twisted and distorted, flung back at me like poisoned darts. These were the very things I would lose, the price I would pay. And I would pay it. I moved through the decaying halls, each step a conscious effort against the growing psychic weight. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight, coalescing into fleeting, grotesque shapes. The manor was alive, fighting back, trying to overwhelm me with its accumulated despair. But I pushed through, driven by a desperate, almost suicidal, determination. I reached the service entrance that led to the deeper, less explored sections. The door, a heavy oak slab, groaned on its hinges as I forced it open, revealing a narrow, descending staircase. No light penetrated this far. I gritted my teeth, gripping the lantern like a lifeline. It stretched ahead, a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel lined with heavy, rusted iron doors. Each door bore a faded, hand-painted number, and etched beneath some of them, almost illegible, were names, dates, fragments of desperate pleas. This was it. The heart of the beast, or at least, one of its vital organs. I had come to perform the ultimate act of erasure. The air in the manor had never felt heavier, nor the silence so profound. Each breath I drew felt like pulling lead into my lungs, but the cold resolve that had settled in my bones was a heavier, more potent weight. This was it. The price I would pay, the battle I would wage, not just for my life, but for the very concept of Reed. My plan, forged in sleepless nights and fueled by a desperate understanding of the entity's hunger, was simple in its terrifying execution: starve it. Deny it the uncertainty, the fear, the doubt it craved. Rusting iron bars, long since pried open or fallen away, still clung to the crumbling stone archways that lined the narrow passage. A thick, cloying stench, like damp earth mixed with something metallic and rotten, coated my tongue. This place felt like a wound, festering and forgotten. The moment I set foot on that grimy floor, the entity struck. It wasn't a physical blow, not at first. "Are you truly Reed?" The words coiled around my skull, a tightening band of pure noise. Then came the visions, flickering at the periphery of my sight: a child's room, bathed in warm afternoon light, a wooden rocking horse with a missing eye. My rocking horse. But the horse's remaining eye was wide and black, staring, judging. I gripped the heavy, iron-bound chest I carried, the one I'd spent weeks restoring, its polished surface cool beneath my trembling fingers. This was my anchor. My shield. My weapon. I had filled it, not with valuables, but with the most mundane, concrete objects I could find: a smooth river stone, a handful of dry soil from the garden, a chipped ceramic mug I'd used every morning for years. Things that were undeniably real, undeniably mine, devoid of emotional resonance for the entity to twist. My father's booming laugh, but distorted, mocking. My mother's soft hum, now a mournful wail. A colleague's casual remark about my meticulousness, twisted into an accusation of obsessive madness. They were darts, aimed directly at the fabric of my identity, each designed to unravel a thread. "You are nothing but dust, Reed," a voice hissed, close to my ear, yet nowhere to be seen. a collection of borrowed memories, fading with each breath. What is your purpose? Your craft is meaningless. The corridors seemed to stretch, the stone walls rippling like water, the air growing thick and viscous, making it hard to draw a breath. My vision blurred, and for a terrifying second, I saw myself not as I was, but as a gaunt, ancient figure, hunched over a workbench, endlessly sanding, endlessly polishing, but never truly creating, only restoring what was already broken. This was the core of its attack. It wasn't just stealing memories, it was rewriting my entire narrative, making me doubt the very foundations of who I believed myself to be. The memories it had flung at me before were just appetizers, this was the main course. I restore. Then, I opened the chest. The simple objects inside, bathed in the faint, sickly light, seemed to glow with a quiet defiance. I reached in and pulled out the river stone. I picked it up. I felt its weight. The entity recoiled, a low, guttural growl vibrating through the very stones of the corridor. It hated the concrete, the undeniable. It thrived on the malleable, the subjective. It changed tactics. The visions became more vivid, more personal. I saw my first restoration project, a delicate porcelain figurine, shattered on the floor, my hands clumsy, inept. My parents, their faces etched with disappointment. The faces of friends, colleagues, all looking at me with scorn. You failed, a chorus chanted, each voice a memory of a minor stumble, magnified into catastrophic failure. You are a fraud. A pretender. My knees threatened to buckle. My carefully constructed resolve wavered. Was it true? Had I always been on the verge of collapse, my meticulous nature merely a facade for deep-seated insecurity? The thought was a poison, seeping into my core. But I fought back. I clutched the river stone, then reached for the chipped mug. I remembered the warmth of the tea in my hands, the faint scent of Earl Grey. I remembered the precise angle of the chip, the smooth lip where it had broken. These were not just memories, they were sensory anchors, This mug, I declared, my voice now a shout, echoing off the decaying walls. It holds my coffee. Every morning. It is my mug. And I am Reed. I am here. In this corridor. The entity shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, a sound of pure agony. The air grew frigid, then searing hot. The walls bucked. The very floor beneath my feet trembled. But I held on. I focused on the texture of the stone, the chipped ceramic, the dry soil. These were immutable. These were facts. These were me. The entity didn't just consume memories, it consumed the belief in them. It fed on the doubt, the uncertainty, the fear that my past, my identity, wasn't solid. My refusal to doubt, my unwavering grip on the concrete, was like poison to it. My resolve, my absolute conviction in my own existence, was a weapon it couldn't counter. The corridor pulsed with a malevolent energy, but I stood my ground, chest heaving, sweat stinging my eyes. The battle for Reed had begun, and for now, I had held the line. I was battered, exhausted, but unbroken. And I was still Reed. The silence that followed was not a bomb. It was a vacuum, absolute and suffocating. I was slumped against the cold, grimy stone of the wall, my legs refusing to hold me. It smelled like rusted iron and old fear, but also like Nothing. My fingers, scraped and raw, found purchase on the damp stone. Had I been here before? A peculiar emptiness bloomed in my chest. My head throbbed. I brought a hand up, my fingers brushing against a sticky patch on my temple. Blood or something else? I couldn't quite focus. The world swayed, a slow, sickening pendulum swing. I pushed off the wall, staggering a few steps, my boots scuffing on the loose grit covering the floor. It was gone. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was a gaping maw, swallowing sound, swallowing thought, swallowing me. It was like trying to grasp smoke. The images were there, fragmented and distorted, a shriek like tearing metal, the walls bucking, the floor trembling, but the why, the how, the intricate sequence of my defiance, eluded me. It was as if a crucial reel of film had been spliced out, leaving only jump cuts and static. I couldn't remember the name of the manor. Not just the name, but the sprawling layout, the specific details of the main hall, the unique carving on the mantelpiece I had spent weeks restoring. It was all a blur, a generalized impression of an old house, nothing concrete, nothing specific to my house. My breath hitched. I closed my eyes, trying to force the memories back, to summon the vivid images I knew should be there. Nothing. It felt strange, foreign on my tongue, a word I was trying on for the first time. My name. But how did I know? What was the anchor? Their faces. Their voices. I could conjure a vague sense of warmth, of comfort, but no specific features, no shared jokes, no distinct memories of childhood. Just a pleasant, formless haze. It was like looking at a photograph that had been left in the sun for too long, all the vibrant colors leached away, leaving only a pale, indistinct ghost. The entity hadn't just been defeated. It had taken a piece of me with it, a payment for its departure. It had fed, not on my life, but on the very essence of who I was. My memories, my identity, the intricate tapestry of my past, it had unraveled them, thread by thread, leaving me with a frayed, incomplete remnant. But the significance, the connection, the long, arduous journey that had led me to this desolate place, it was all gone. Replaced by a vast, echoing emptiness. The silence wasn't just in the corridor, it was in my head, a blank slate where a vibrant history once resided. My hands trembled. I looked at them, observing the calluses, the faint scars from years of restoration work. They felt familiar, yet detached, as if they belonged to an accomplished artisan I vaguely knew, not to me. The intricate knowledge, the muscle memory, the passion for my craft, was it still there? The cost of my victory was laid bare, and it was devastating. I had driven back the thing that consumed memory, but it had consumed mine in its dying throes. I was alive, yes. But a significant portion of Reed, the man, the restorer, the son, the friend, was simply gone. Irretrievably lost. I had survived, but I was a stranger to myself. The lingering scars weren't on my skin, they were etched into the very core of my fractured being. The silence that followed was not a bomb. It was a vacuum, absolute and suffocating. My muscles screamed, every fiber protesting the ordeal, but the pain felt distant, like a memory of someone else's suffering. I blinked, the effort monumental, and found myself staring at a ceiling of raw, unpainted concrete, streaked with what looked like ancient water damage. A single, bare bulb, caged behind a wire mesh, pulsed with a sickly yellow light above me. My breath hitched, a dry, rattling sound in the hollow space. The air was thick with the smell of stale damp, rust, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like old blood, or maybe just the iron in the surrounding structure. I pushed myself up, every joint protesting with a symphony of clicks and groans. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache behind my eyes. Where was I? The Manor. Had I escaped? The room was small, sparse. For concrete walls, a heavy steel door with a small, barred window set high up. No windows to the outside. My gaze drifted, trying to find some anchor, some clue. Death row? Marked for closure? This wasn't the Manor. This wasn't any part of the Manor I knew. But how did I get here? Had I won? Had I found a way to sever the connection, to break free? A flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, sparked within me. I was alive. I was here. I was. Reed. Yes, my name was Reed. Reed. Antique Restorer. The entity. It all coalesced, fragmented but present. I stood, my legs wobbly, and stumbled towards the door. My reflection stared back at me from the dull metal, distorted but undeniably mine. Gaunt, eyes wide with a manic intensity, hair matted, clothes torn. I looked like a ghost, a survivor. A victor. I tried the handle. Locked, of course. I rattled it, then pounded with my fist. The sound echoed, swallowed by the vast emptiness beyond. No response. Panic began to coil in my gut. What kind of closure was this? Was I simply abandoned here? Left to rot? The Manor, the overwhelming presence, the final, desperate struggle. It was all a blur. A triumphant blur, I told myself, a necessary haze after such an ordeal. I turned from the door, my gaze sweeping the cell-like room again. There was a small, grimy sink and a toilet in the corner. Nothing else. No furniture, no personal effects. My hands went to my pockets, finding them empty. My tools, my phone, my wallet, all gone. A deep, unsettling unease began to replace the initial surge of relief. Why here? Why this place? And why? Couldn't I remember the escape itself? I remembered the intention to escape, the fight, but the actual act of leaving the Manor, of arriving here, was a blank. A crucial, terrifying blank. Was this my victory? To trade one prison for another? It wasn't a voice, more like a sensation, a gentle tugging at the edges of my perception. It felt familiar, insidious. Closure. The word resonated, deep in my bones. I needed to remember. What was my mother's maiden name? What was the first antique I ever restored? Simple, foundational facts. But the answers were hazy, replaced by fleeting images of unfamiliar faces, architectural blueprints I'd never seen, forgotten histories of properties I'd never owned. My eyes snapped open. This wasn't right. My own memories felt like borrowed clothes, ill-fitting and strange. I paced the small room, a frantic energy building inside me. The ringing in my ears intensified, a crescendo of static. It consumed memories, replaced them, blurred the lines. What if my victory wasn't an escape at all? What if it was the entity's final, most brilliant maneuver? I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I looked at my reflection in the steel door again, truly looked. My eyes, once a clear, determined blue, seemed to hold a flicker of something else now, a depth that wasn't mine, a stillness that was utterly alien. My expression. It was still gaunt, still desperate, but beneath it, a faint, almost imperceptible smile played on my lips. Not my smile. It was too knowing, too ancient, and the name. I tried to say it aloud. Like a word I was trying on for size, rather than one that belonged to me. My mind, stripped bare, its identity slowly, meticulously being executed, cell by cell, memory by memory, and the closure? That was the final, terrifying realization. There was no escape. There had never been an escape. I hadn't won. I was merely the newest artifact, curated and displayed within the vast, echoing chambers of the entity's consciousness. My mind, a meticulously restored, desolate corridor, now waiting for its own final closure. And somewhere, deep within the manor, the entity smiled. Through my eyes.